Your methods are too inflexible, Mark. We require financial experts who recognize the importance of adaptability in the modern marketplace. My boss, Vanessa Harrington, the CEO of Blackidge Financial Services, sat across from me in her elegant office with its glass walls, not quite meeting my gaze as she delivered the news. Beside her, Charles Monroe, the recently hired chief strategy officer who had joined the company only 5 months earlier, nodded in solemn agreement. My name is Mark Reynolds. I am 46 years old, and until that moment, I had served as the chief compliance officer at Blackidge, one of Boston's fastest-growing wealth management firms, for 9 years. I had protected the company's regulatory status and made sure our clients' investments were managed with complete integrity. The board feels we need a more forward-thinking interpretation of compliance, Charles added, adjusting his custom-made Italian tie. Financial regulations are guidelines, not rigid, unchangeable rules. I looked back and forth between them, keeping my expression neutral despite the anger swelling within me. Guidelines enforced by federal law and the SEC? I responded calmly. Vanessa let out a dramatic sigh. This is precisely the issue we're addressing, Mark. This black and white thinking, she said. The industry is changing, and our competitors have compliance officers who help them navigate ambiguities instead of obstructing progress at every turn. What she meant was clear. I wouldn't bend the rules to accommodate their increasingly aggressive investment strategies. I wouldn't approve the dubious fee structures Charles had been pushing for our top clients. I wouldn't ignore their attempts to bypass disclosure requirements. When does this become effective? I asked, already certain of the answer. Immediately, Charles replied, pushing a folder across the polished table. HR has prepared your separation package, 2 months severance, continued health coverage through the quarter, standard confidentiality agreements, and your replacement. I couldn't help but ask, who's my replacement? A hint of a smile appeared on Vanessa's face. We've brought in Rebecca Taylor from Meridian Capital, she said. She has a more modern understanding of compliance frameworks. Rebecca Taylor. Knew of her by her reputation as a career-driven individual who had jumped between 4 firms in 6 years, leaving each one just before regulatory issues emerged. She was precisely the type of compliance officer they desired, someone who saw herself as a facilitator rather than a protector. You'll need to clean out your office today, Charles added, checking his watch. I'll oversee the transfer of your files and deactivate your access by the end of the day. As I left Vanessa's office with the signed termination papers, I noticed junior associates avoiding eye contact with me. The news had spread quickly by the time I reached my office. My assistant Jessica was waiting, her expression a mix of shock and indignation. They can't do this, she whispered, following me inside. Everyone knows you're the only reason we passed the SEC audit last year. I offered her a small smile as I started gathering my personal belongings from my desk. Apparently that's the problem, I said. As I packed my possessions, family photos, industry awards, the antique fountain pen my father had given me when I passed the bar exam into a cardboard box, I considered my next steps. I had just been fired for doing my job correctly, for protecting clients, the firm, and even Vanessa and Charles from their own poor judgment. Yet, as I placed my ethics certifications into the box, something caught my eye through my office window. Charles was already walking with Rebecca Taylor through the trading floor, introducing her to key staff. They hadn't just replaced me today. They had planned this, waiting until I refused to approve their latest innovative fee structure for the Lincoln Pension Fund account. That was when I realized this wasn't simply about my rigid approach. It was about getting rid of the final obstacle to whatever Blackidge was planning next. I left the building carrying 9 years of my professional integrity in a single cardboard box. Nodding goodbye to the security guard who seemed genuinely confused to see me leaving in the middle of the afternoon. In the parking garage, I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes. Not yet ready to drive away and make my termination feel final, my phone buzzed with text messages from colleagues expressing their shock and support, but one message stood out. It was from Timothy Grayson, our head of digital security. They're already trying to access your secured compliance server files. It read, whatever you documented, they want it gone. I stared at the message, a chilling realization sinking in.
Oh.
They were trying to erase my work, the documentation of every compliance warning, every rejected proposal, every questionable strategy I had flagged during my time there. Fortunately for me, and unfortunately for them, they had missed something crucial in their hurry to remove me. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in South Boston, I learned early on that trust must be earned, not freely given. My father, a police officer, instilled in me a deep respect for rules, not just as limitations, but as protections. Rules keep honest people safe from those who believe they're above them, he would say. I carried that philosophy with me through law school, into my early career at the SEC, and eventually to Blackidge Financial Services. When I joined Blackidge in 2014, it's a mid-sized wealth management firm with a solid reputation. The founder, Richard Blackidge, believed that long-term success came from prioritizing clients. If we grow their wealth ethically, our growth will follow naturally, he often said. For 6 years, we operated according to that philosophy. Then, Richard retired, and the board appointed Vanessa Harrington, a charismatic executive with an aggressive, growth-focused mindset. Within a year, she had set ambitious goals to double assets under management and increase profit margins by 40%. At first, her strategies were innovative but completely legal. Better technology, streamlined operations, targeted marketing to high-net-worth clients. But as external pressures mounted and growth targets became more demanding, the nature of her innovations began to shift. The first sign came when she hired Charles Monroe as Chief Strategy Officer, bypassing several qualified internal candidates. Charles came from Sterling Capital, a firm that had recently paid a $43 million settlement for fee misrepresentation. Even though he had conveniently left before charges were filed, within weeks of his arrival, the number of compliance red flags in my department increased dramatically. Proposals for fee structures that disguised costs from clients, investment strategies that didn't align with client risk profiles, and documentation that obscured rather than clarified terms each time. I would reject the proposals with detailed explanations of the regulatory issues. Each time, Vanessa and Charles would push back, questioning whether the rules really applied in a specific context or suggesting creative interpretations of disclosure requirements. 3 weeks ago, they went too far, crossing a line I couldn't. Ignore the Lincoln Pension Fund, which represented 28,000 municipal workers and was valued at over $1.2 billion. It's our largest client. Charles proposed a new fee structure that would effectively double our management fees while concealing the increase in complex administrative charges. This violates SEC Rule 206-247. I explained in our executive meeting. It's designed to mislead the client about the total fees. It's designed to align our compensation with the extraordinary value we provide, Charles countered. The Lincoln board members aren't financial experts. The simplified presentation prevents unnecessary confusion. What you're calling simplified is what regulators call material omission, I responded. I can't approve this. Vanessa intervened, her tone controlled but cold. Mark, let's reconsider. Maybe you could work with Charles to find a compromise. A way to achieve our goals while addressing your concerns. There's no compromising on disclosure requirements, I replied. The client has a right to understand exactly what they're paying. The meeting ended with tension hanging in the air. Later that day, I documented the exchange and added it to my confidential compliance records, a practice I had maintained meticulously. Throughout my tenure, I documented every questionable proposal, every overruled concern, every instance where I'd had to hold the line against internal pressure. The thought Vanessa and Charles couldn't know was that I had established a secure backup protocol after the first troubling proposals appeared. Every compliance document, every email exchange, every recorded meeting where questionable practices were discussed was automatically copied to an encrypted server that only I could access. This wasn't paranoia, it was prudence. In the financial industry, compliance officers often become scapegoats when things go wrong. My records were my insurance policy, and as it turned out, they would become much more. The day after my termination, I met with Patricia Winters, an attorney specializing in financial industry whistleblower cases. I'd known Patricia since our days at Boston University Law School and trusted her judgment completely. "They fired you for doing your job correctly," she said after reviewing my termination documents. "That's a textbook case of retaliation. But proving it would be difficult without evidence of the specific violations you refuse to approve." "Have the evidence," I replied, "detailed records of every questionable proposal. Every compliance flag, every conversation where I warned them about regulatory risks." Patricia's eyebrows rose. "These records are secure, not on company servers they can access. Completely secure, and verified with timestamps and digital signatures," I said. "They can't claim I fabricated them after leaving." She nodded. "Slowly. That's potentially powerful, but we need to be strategic. Whistleblower cases are marathon battles, not sprints, and financial firms have deep pockets for legal defense." "What are my options?" I asked. "Several paths," she said, leaning forward. "We could file a whistleblower complaint with the SEC, which offers protections and potential compensation if violations are proven. We could pursue wrongful termination. Or," she paused, "we could wait." "Wait for what?" I asked. "For them to actually carry out the violations you prevented," she said. "Right now, they fired you. But if they haven't yet executed the questionable strategies you blocked, regulatory action would be based on intent, not action. That's much harder to prove." I considered this. "The Lincoln Pension Fund proposal," I said. "They'll implement it now that I'm gone. Rebecca Taylor will approve it." "Then that's what we monitor," Patricia said. "If they move forward with that fee structure, the violation becomes concrete. Your documentation becomes evidence of knowing. Misconduct, not just hypothetical discussions." I nodded, a plan beginning to form. "And in the meantime," I asked. "In the meantime, you document everything from your time there, organize your evidence, and watch for their next move. But discreetly," she added. "If they realize you're building a case, they might reverse course before creating actionable violations." 3 days later, Jessica, my former assistant, who had decided to resign after my termination, called me from a coffee shop near the Blackage offices. "They're moving fast," she said, keeping her voice low. "Rebecca approved the Lincoln fee structure yesterday. Charles is personally presenting it to Lincoln's board next Tuesday. Has anyone raised concerns?" I asked. "A few people in the compliance department questioned it, but Rebecca shut them down," Jessica said. She said it was fully vetted and approved at the executive level. The implementation team is already updating the billing systems. This was happening even faster than I had anticipated. With the Lincoln presentation just days away, I needed to decide whether to intervene before they misled their largest client. Evening, I received an unexpected call from Harold Winters, the head of Lincoln's investment committee, and a man I'd worked with closely over the years. "Mark, I heard you left Blackage," he said, his gravelly voice both familiar and welcome. "Surprised they let someone of your caliber go." "Philosophical differences," I replied diplomatically. He grunted, unconvinced. "Well, we've got this presentation coming up Tuesday, a new structure proposal. Anything I should know about it?" The question lingered in the air. Harold was giving me a perfect opening, but I had to be careful. Blackage would certainly have made me sign non-disparagement clauses in any final settlement. "Harold, I'm not in a position to discuss specific Blackage proposals," I said carefully. "But as someone who respects your due diligence, I'd suggest asking very direct questions about total fee impact and how various charges are categorized." "That's specific, eh?" Harold was sharp enough to read between the lines. "Any particular categories I should inquire about?" "Administrative service charges, technology platform fees, and special advisory allocations would be standard areas for thorough examination in any fee review," I said. "I see." His tone indicated he understood perfectly. "Well, I appreciate it. Your non-specific general advice, Mark. Always valued your integrity." After hanging up, I stared out my home office window at the Boston skyline. I hadn't directly violated any agreements, but I'd given Harold enough to approach the presentation with appropriate skepticism. Would it be enough? The answer came 2 days later, when my phone exploded with notifications. The Boston Financial Journal had published a breaking story. Lincoln Pension Fund rejects Blackage proposal. Cites deceptive fee practices. Launching. Full audit of relationship. Out. According to the article, the Lincoln Investment Committee had asked such pointed questions about the fee structure that Charles was forced to admit the effective rate would nearly double. When pressed on why this wasn't clearly disclosed, he had reportedly become defensive, prompting Harold to call for an immediate audit of all Blackage invoices from the past 2 years. By afternoon, the story had been picked up by national financial media. Blackage's stock dropped 8% in a single day. The damage control was immediate. A press release from Vanessa, expressing disappointment in the miscommunication and announcing an internal review of presentation protocols. Meanwhile, my phone lit up with a text from Timothy. In it was complete panic at executive level. VNC demanding access to your old compliance records. Its digital team working overtime to find everything you flagged regarding Lincoln. They were scrambling to identify what evidence might exist of their intentional deception. But the backup server with my compliance records remained untouched, unknown to them. The next morning, Patricia called me, her voice charged with rare excitement. The Lincoln story changes everything, she said. This isn't theoretical anymore. They actually attempted to implement the deceptive fee structure you refused to approve. And Lincoln's audit announcement creates legitimate regulatory satori. Concerns, I added. So what's our next move? I asked. I've been contacted by 2 other Blackage clients asking questions about their fee structures, she said. The Lincoln story has them worried. This is spreading. Harold's doing, I'd guess, I said, probably. The point is, Blackage is now facing a credibility crisis, which means we have leverage we didn't have a week ago for a settlement, potentially much more. I've had informal discussions with contacts at the SEC, with the Lincoln situation making headlines. They're interested in your documentation. 2 days later, Patricia and I met with Sandra Michaels from the Sex Enforcement Division in her austere government office. I provided secure access to my compliance records, 9 years of meticulously documented conversations, proposals, warnings, and overruled concerns. This is comprehensive, Sandra said, reviewing the organized files. You've essentially created a roadmap of escalating violations. Potential violations, Patricia corrected. Most were prevented because Mark refused to approve them until they fired him specifically to implement them, Sandra noted, looking up from her screen. The timing between your final rejection of the Lincoln fee structure and your termination is particularly problematic for Blackage. As we left the meeting, Sandra assured us the SEC would move quickly on a preliminary investigation. But as we walked back to Patricia's office, I felt strangely empty. Yes, Blackage would likely face regulatory consequences, but that wouldn't restore my reputation or career. What happens now? Asked Patricia as we waited for the elevator. Now, we wait for the SEC to determine if they'll pursue formal action, she said. But in the meantime, we should prepare for the inevitable, which is, Blackage will learn about the sex interest any day now. When they do, they'll realize you've provided documentation, and they'll come after you, claiming you stole proprietary information, violated confidentiality agreements, anything to discredit you and your evidence. She was right. The next day, I received a certified letter from Blackage's legal department, alleging I had misappropriated confidential company information and demanding the return of all stolen materials under threat of immediate legal action. Patricia advised me not to respond directly. This is just their opening move, she explained. They're testing to see what you have and how you'll react. Instead of engaging on their terms, we prepared a formal whistleblower submission to the SEC supplementing my compliance records with a detailed account of the retaliatory termination. Under SEC rules, this provided me with certain protections against corporate retaliation protections that would prove essential in the coming weeks. As Patricia had predicted, Blackage escalated quickly. 3 days after my whistleblower filing, they sued me for breach of contract, theft of proprietary information, and defamation, seeking an emergency injunction to prevent me from sharing any company documents with regulators or the press. In a hastily arranged court hearing, Blackage's attorneys portrayed me as a disgruntled employee who had stolen confidential information after being legitimately terminated for performance issues. They claimed I had orchestrated the Lincoln pension fund rejection to satisfy a personal vendetta. Patricia calmly countered by introducing the formal SEC whistleblower filing and the federal protections it provided. My client's actions are protected by federal securities laws that explicitly override any confidentiality agreements when reporting potential violations to regulators, she explained to the judge. The judge, a no-nonsense veteran of financial cases, seemed unimpressed with Blackage's emergency filing. It appears the defendant is exercising legally protected whistleblower rights, she noted. And unless you can demonstrate that the information provided to regulators is false or irrelevant to potential violations, these claims are premature. Blackage's motion for an emergency injunction was denied. As we left the courthouse, Patricia squeezed my arm encouragingly. "First round, too. Us," she said. "But they'll be back with something stronger." She was right again. The next day, an article appeared in the Financial Tribune quoting anonymous sources familiar with the situation who claimed I had been terminated for my own ethical violations, specifically for attempting to use compliance approvals as leverage for personal compensation increases. It was a complete fabrication, but a clever one. They were trying to ruin my reputation and credibility before the SEC investigation gained momentum. To my surprise, the counterattack came from an unexpected source. 3 members of Blackage's compliance team, including 2 senior managers, submitted a joint letter to the company's board of directors with copies to major financial publications, defending my ethical conduct and confirming that I had been terminated after refusing to approve questionable fee structures. Their letter detailed specific instances where compliance concerns I had raised were inappropriately overruled by executive leadership, particularly after Charles Monroe's arrival, concluded with a devastating line: the company's attempt to impugn Mark Reynolds' character rather than address the substantive issues he identified only reinforces the cultural problems that led to this situation. The letter, of course, leaked immediately. By evening, it dominated financial news. Blackage's stock fell another 12%. Clients began publicly demanding audits of their fee structures, the SEC receiving independent corroboration of my claims from current employees accelerated their investigation. The next morning, I received a call I never expected. "Mark, it's Richard Blackage. It's a founder and former CEO, retired for 3 years, was the last person I expected to hear from. I've been watching the situation unfold," he continued, his voice carrying the same measured confidence I remembered. "I'd like to meet privately." We arranged to meet at his home in Beacon Hill that afternoon. The elegant townhouse reflected its owner, classic, understated, with a quiet dignity. Richard welcomed me into his study, where financial journals and newspapers were spread across his desk, many featuring stories about the company that still bore his name. "I built Blackage on a simple premise," he said after we were seated, "that we would grow alongside our clients, not at their expense. And that integrity wasn't just a marketing term but the foundation of sustainable success." He looked older than I remembered, his shoulders slightly stooped, but his eyes remained sharp and discerning. When I chose Vanessa as my successor, I believed she understood that. Perhaps the pressure of quarterly expectations clouded her judgment. He sighed heavily. Or perhaps I misjudged her character entirely. "Why did you want to see me, Richard?" I asked. "Because I've retained significant shareholder voting power and influence with the board," he replied. "And because I've spent the past 2 days speaking with Harold Winters at Lincoln, reviewing your compliance records, and speaking with current Blackage employees, I needed to determine for myself whether this was a misunderstanding that had spiraled out of control or something more fundamental." "And what did you conclude?" Richard's expression hardened. "That the company I built has been corrupted by short-term thinking and ethical compromises. That you were doing exactly what I would have expected from my chief compliance officer, protecting clients and the firm itself from regulatory risks and reputational damage." He leaned forward, his voice lowering. "I've called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. I intend to demand Vanessa and Charles's immediate removal and a complete reversal of the problematic practices you identified. I'm asking if you would consider returning not just to your previous role, but as interim CEO while we rebuild trust with clients and regulators. The offer stunned me. Richard, I appreciate your confidence, but I filed a whistleblower complaint. With the SEC, I've provided evidence that may result in significant penalties for Blackage. He nodded solemnly. As you should have. The company must face appropriate consequences for its actions, but afterward, it will need ethical leadership to implement reforms and restore integrity. Who better than the person who refused to compromise in the first place? I left Richard's home without giving him an answer, my mind reeling with possibilities I hadn't considered. Could I actually return to Blackage? Did I even want to, after how I'd been treated? That evening, as I contemplated Richard's offer, Patricia called with breaking news. The SEC just announced a formal investigation into Blackage's fee disclosure practices, she said. And there's more. The Lincoln Pension Fund has filed a civil lawsuit alleging systematic fee misrepresentation. They're seeking damages and full fee restitution. Any response from Blackage? I asked. Nothing official yet, she said, but sources say there's chaos in the executive suite. Vanessa reportedly locked herself in her office with legal counsel. For most of the afternoon, the next morning, financial news channels led with a stunning announcement. Blackage's board had removed Vanessa Harrington and Charles Monroe, effective immediately. Richard Blackage would return as interim chairman with a mandate to restore the company's founding values and rebuild client trust. By noon, I received a formal communication from the reconstituted board extending an official offer to return as Chief Compliance Officer with expanded authority and direct board reporting lines, eliminating the executive interference that had created the problems. In the first place, the offer acknowledged the wrongful nature of my termination, provided substantial compensation for damages, and explicitly committed to implementing comprehensive compliance reforms under my direction. Patricia reviewed the offer carefully. This is unprecedented, she admitted. Usually whistleblowers are permanently exiled from their industries, not invited back with increased authority. Richard must have wielded extraordinary influence with the board. Is it even compatible with the ongoing SEC investigation? I asked. Actually, yes, she said. The SEC typically looks favorably on companies that take decisive action to address violations, removing responsible executives and strengthening compliance functions. Your return would be seen as evidence of genuine reform, potentially reducing penalties. I was torn. Turning to Blackage would provide the opportunity to implement the proper compliance framework I'd always advocated for. But it would also mean working amid the debris of broken trust and organizational trauma. After days of deliberation and discussions with Patricia, Richard, and even Harold from Lincoln, I made my decision. I would return to Blackage, but not as Chief Compliance Officer. Instead, I accepted a newly created position, Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, with direct board reporting and veto authority over any client-facing fee structures or investment strategies. My first day back at Blackage felt surreal. Walking through the same lobby where I'd exited with a cardboard box just weeks earlier, I was now greeted with nervous smiles and uncertain glances. The company had been through a seismic shift, and nobody was quite sure what would come next. Richard had arranged a town hall meeting for my first morning back, with all employees gathered in the main conference area. He introduced me not as a returning executive, but as the embodiment of the values the company needed to reclaim. Mark Reynolds stood firm when it would have been easier to compromise, Richard told the assembled staff. He chose integrity over expediency, client interests over short-term profits. Those are the principles that will guide Blackage forward. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my message simple. I'm not back to assign blame or revisit past decisions, I told them. I'm here because I believe in what this company can be when we prioritize ethical conduct and client trust. The path forward won't be easy, but if we commit to doing things right, even when it's difficult, Blackage can emerge stronger than before. Over the following months, that commitment was tested repeatedly. The SEC investigation concluded with Blackage paying a $18 million penalty substantial, far less than it might have been without our proactive reforms. The Lincoln Pension Fund settlement required full fee restitution plus damages, costing another $22 million. Several smaller clients followed with their own claims. But throughout this turbulent period, we implemented comprehensive compliance reforms. Every fee structure was reviewed and simplified for transparency. Client communications were redesigned to provide absolute clarity on costs and investment strategies. And most importantly, compliance considerations became integrated into every stage of the decision-making process. Rather than being treated as a final hurdle to overcome, 6 months after my return, we held our first post-crisis client conference. Harold Winters from Lincoln, who had chosen to maintain a reduced relationship with the reformed Blackage, agreed to participate in a panel discussion on transparency in financial services. During the Q&A session, an attendee asked Harold why Lincoln had stayed with Blackage after discovering the fee discrepancies. "Because organizations like people deserve the chance to learn from mistakes and demonstrate change," Harold replied. "We stayed because Blackage did something rare in the financial world. They prioritized integrity over image by bringing back the very person who had tried to prevent the problems in the first place." After the conference, as attendees mingled over cocktails, I found a quiet moment alone with Richard on the venue's terrace. "When did you first suspect something was wrong at Blackage?" I asked him. He smiled ruefully. "When I heard they'd fired you. I knew you too well to believe you compromised on compliance matters, and I knew that if the leadership felt they needed you gone, they must have been planning something that wouldn't withstand your scrutiny. I'm surprised you had that much faith in me," I admitted. "Faith based on evidence," he corrected. 9 years of watching you work, seeing how you balanced regulatory requirements with business needs without compromising either. When they dismissed that balance as too rigid, I knew the problem wasn't with your approach." As Richard returned inside to mingle with clients, I remained on the terrace, watching the Boston skyline transition from day to evening. In my new role, I'd encountered both resistance and relief resistance from those who still believed compliance was an obstacle to overcome, and relief from those who appreciated the protection that clear boundaries provided. What had begun as a personal injustice, my termination for doing my job correctly, had ultimately revealed a deeper truth about the financial industry. Rules existed not just as constraints, but as foundations for sustainable success. Integrity wasn't a luxury to be discarded when it's inconvenient, but an essential component of long-term stability. Vanessa and Charles had seen me as an obstacle to their vision of aggressive growth and flexible compliance. They had removed me, thinking it would clear their path, never realizing that in doing so, they had triggered the very scrutiny they hoped to avoid. The irony wasn't lost on me. By firing the person who insisted on following the rules, they had set in motion a series of events that proved exactly why those rules existed in the first place. As I watched the city lights emerge against the darkening sky, I felt a sense of professional vindication, yes, but also a deeper satisfaction in knowing that hundreds of thousands of pension beneficiaries, individual investors, and retirement savers would now have their assets managed with the transparency and care they deserved. Sometimes, being rigid about doing the right thing is exactly what's needed in a world too willing to bend.